Hi, with this episode of How We Got Here, the recent train disaster in Ohio, I thought it would be interesting to look at some train history. Now, from the beginning of time, horses were the way to move large amounts of material. Many continents didn't have horses. The Western Hemisphere didn't until the Spaniards came over. But after horses, it was canals. And so in Mesopotamia and then China and then Egypt and the Romans built tremendous waterworks and canals and the Russians and Germans. But after canals, it was trains. And the invention of the railroad was a significant event in world history. And so if we look at the development of railroads and trains, we have to go back to the steam engine. So from the beginning of time, people burned wood. And in Ireland, they burned peat moss. This was from the bogs, these swampy, mucky areas where you'd have the green stuff would go into a swamp and it wouldn't decompose all the way and it would get buried and buried and buried. And you would have this swamp mud, but it would dry out and it had a high carbon content. And so it would burn. And but in Scotland and England, they used coal. And so they would dig in the earth and have coal mines. And then coal mines would fill up gradually with water, the ground seepage. And so in 1698, someone named Thomas Savery invented a hand pump to pump water out of coal mines. In 1712, Thomas Newcomb invented a steam pump to help pump water out of coal mines. But the big change happened in 1765, where James Watt improved Thomas Newcomb's pump tremendously and turned it into a steam engine. And this began what's called the Industrial Revolution. And James Watt coined the term horsepower. To see how powerful his engines were, he would have a horse pull a amount of stuff on a cable and see how much he could lift. And so he came up with a unit called horsepower. And in honor of James Watt, when electricity was being studied, the term watt, his name, was used as a unit of energy transfer. So when you have watts, that's where that came from. In 1807, you had someone adapt the steam engine to steam boats, and his name was Robert Fulton. And this revolutionized river travel and ocean travel. So instead of having to wait for the winds to blow, you would be able to travel quite fast with a paddle boat. These steam engines were also used for textile factories, making bolts of cloth and all kinds of machinery. And then in 1813, the steam engine was used to make a locomotive. And this was John Blenkinsop. And that it was in Britain. And now you could move large amounts of heavy things, and they put down the rails. And so they very quickly put railroads across Britain. And a phenomenon happened. Everybody would set their clocks by the sun coming up. And when you could move something very quickly across the country, it would get there before the time it left sometimes. And so they decided to standardize what we call time zones and the Greenwich Mean Time and so forth. And then the British began to colonize, and for quite a while, they had the largest empire in the world, and they would build railroads and have steamboats. And so they took over India. And so the British put in railroads and steamboats across India, and something happened. In the Ganges River, there were people that bathed in it, and it had sewage in it, and they would get a waterborne disease called cholera. And now, instead of it being a local disease, people infected with cholera could get on these trains and quickly go back to the ports and get on steamboats and quickly get back to Europe, and it spread. And so people infected with cholera caused hundreds of millions to die in Europe, Asia, and in America in 1849. It was called the disease of the 19th century. Now, as railroads were important for industry and rail trains were pulled by locomotives, it developed the science of making locomotives. And the main piece of a locomotive is a boiler. And it may seem simple, but it was quite complicated. It had to be at the right pressure, and it had water in it. If you let the water get down too low and then you put water in too fast, it would flash on the hot metal, turn into steam, and blow the whole thing up. It was very complicated. And so the studying of making boilers was the high tech of the day. And so it was Lincoln that helped establish the Purdue University in Indiana. And they had engineers that made boilers. And so their name was the Boilermakers. And it still has that today when you see the basketball teams playing. It's the Purdue University Boilermakers. But boilers were important for railroads. And then with the British colonizing, building railroads across India, you had some American businessmen and bankers. And in 1848, they, along with the U.S. Senate, came to an agreement with Grand Colombia, which at the time included Panama, Colombia, and some of the Latin American countries. They came into an agreement to build a railroad across the Isthmus of Panama, 50 miles long. They tried building a canal across, and the French did, and other countries did, and thousands and thousands died of malaria. And so you had the Americans come along and says, well, we'll try to do a railroad across there. And it was just in time for the 1849 California Gold Rush. And so there's this push to build this 50-mile railroad. Well, they had a small portion of it built when Ulysses S. Grant was a captain in the military, and they were wanting to move stuff from the East Coast to the West Coast. And instead of sailing in the 4-month journey around South America, the decision was made to travel across the Isthmus of Panama. Short part was by train, but then they had to get off and walk through the jungle. And with malaria and the diseases, hundreds died. And Ulysses S. Grant said the men were dying of cholera by the hour. And but the railroad was completed across Panama in 1855. And Mark Twain rode on it. And he was a correspondent for the Chicago Republican newspaper. And he wrote in August 17th of 1868, Mark Twain said, "The Panama Railroad is an American project. We took the train at Panama, clattered for 2 or 3 hours through a tangled wilderness of tropical vegetation, and discharged ourselves at Aspinwall," which later got named Cologne. It is only 45 miles across the Isthmus of Panama. That little road has carried about 100,000 passengers for the California steamers. They had the steamers waiting on the other side to take people to San Francisco. So Mark Twain goes on. That little railroad carried about 100,000 passengers for the California steamers during the past 12 months. It was a hard road to build. The tropical fevers slaughtered the laborers by wholesale. It is a popular saying that every railroad tie from Panama to Aspinwall rests upon a corpse. It is claimed that this little railroad enterprise cost the lives of 10,000 men. It is possible. Now, when I was in college, I had a friend in Panama, and so I went down there and I rode on that railroad. And yes, it was a charming little railroad through the jungle, but it's hard to imagine the number of lives that were lost building that. During the Civil War, railroads were important to both sides. And one of the instances was the Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. And he pioneered the total destruction warfare concept, where instead of defeating the enemy on the battlefield, you would destroy their supplies and their supply lines. And it was a tragic introduction into the world of warfare. but it has now become standard. But in 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman, his drive to Atlanta, and then his famous March to the Sea, destroyed the railroads that the South used. But they didn't want them just to come along and rebuild it. And so they would heat the railroad rails over fires and then bend them in a circle around a tree. So they were called Sherman's bow ties. And so once they were bent, there's no way that you could straighten them out sufficient to use them. And so it more or less permanently destroyed the railroad in the South. 1866, a Swedish inventor named Alfred Nobel invented dynamite. And he was building there in Stockholm. And he felt, I guess, a little bad that it could also be used as explosives in war to kill people. And so he decided to give his Alfred Nobel Prize, or the Nobel Prize, to someone that would make advances in peace. And so we see somebody got the Nobel Prize for different things. But 1866, Alfred Nobel invented dynamite. Why is that important? Now railroads could go through mountains. And in 1869, you had the Transcontinental Railroad that finally was completed at Promontory Point, Utah, with the last spike being driven in. And it was built with the help of 20,000 Chinese immigrants. They weren't getting enough Americans to sign up, and someone had the idea to bring over Chinese, and they came over by the thousands and worked really hard for very little wages. And but the railroad could not have been completed without them. And then in 1883, America adopts time zones. We had the Samuel Morse invent the telegraph, and the telegraph first was used to have a Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. And the first quote was a verse from the Bible, "What hath God wrought?" But they would build telegraph along railroad lines. And sure enough, they found out that each area of the country set their clocks by the sun coming up. And with the trains leaving one place, they had a confusion. So 1883, America adopts time zones. Canada, 1885, finishes their Canadian Transcontinental Railroad, which was the longest railroad in the world at the time, over 3,000 miles. Railroads played a part in international politics. In 1903, you had the Kaiser Wilhelm make a treaty with the Ottoman Sultan and to build the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad, because Germany didn't have oil and they were industrializing and needed oil. And Baghdad had Kirkuk in different areas. And so this was a railroad. You may have seen the movie with Lawrence of Arabia, and Lawrence of Arabia helped blow up portions of the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad. Half of World War I took place in the Middle East. After the war, Europe redrew the map, and the map of the Middle East was redrawn. And of course, that's when Israel came into being. The Soviet Union. Stalin attempted to build a railroad to the Arctic Ocean, but it never got completed. It was called the infamous Railway to Nowhere. 300,000 Gulag prisoners. Gulag was a labor camp. They died trying to build this thing in this far north area where it was minus 50 degrees in the winters. And then you had railroads in Asia. And so China at the time had been somewhat lagging in industrial development, but Japan was on the forefront. And Japan was able to get permission to build a railroad along an area of China, along the coast. And in 1931, they claimed that there was a railroad explosion at Mukden. And so Japan used this as an excuse to invade China and kill over 100,000 in Nanking, China. Later, an international group walked the entire length of the railroad, and there was no explosion. They simply came up with the story as an excuse to invade. And so this is a typical political strategy where an aggressor nation or an aggressor political group will create a crisis or an insurrection and blame it on the innocent group as an excuse to invade and to kill off their opponents. Anyway, so that's 1931. But with Japan invading China, we can't close without the story of Gladys Aylward. And so she is an English housemaid, and she's 27 years old. And she decides she wants to be a missionary to China. And so in 1930, Gladys Aylward takes her life savings and, as a single woman, makes an unbelievably dangerous and harrowing trip across the Trans-Siberian Railroad from all the way across the Soviet Union to China. It's 5,867 miles, the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It took a century to build. It was begun in 1891. Well, here's this young woman, Gladys Aylward. She finally makes it to China. She's working with the China Inland Mission. And among other things, she helps end the foot binding of little Chinese girls. The royalty would bind the girls' feet with cloth when they were infants, and so their body would grow, but their feet would stay tiny and useless, so they would have to be carried everywhere. And so it was considered a royal thing to be carried everywhere. That was where the royalty would also not trim their fingernails, and they would get real long, and they had to have servants even feed them. And we can't relate to that, but Gladys Aylward helped end the feet binding of little girls in China. And she was, when Japan did invade China, Gladys Aylward in 1938 led 100 Chinese orphans to escape China from the Japanese across a dangerous journey through the mountains. And it was such an heroic act that a movie was made about it. Ingrid Bergman starred in the movie, 1958, titled Inn of Sixth Happiness. And that's a fascinating movie, and I encourage you to watch it. Anyway, fascinating talk on railroads, and I hope this was interesting to you. God bless.